4. And Carl's got the recording on. So I'd like to introduce our next plenary speaker, who is Dr. Jackie Stewart. She's an associate professor of teaching at UBC Vancouver. I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just highlight that she is an associate editor at the Journal of Chemical Education. And she's our recent awardee of the 2022 CIC Award for Chemical Education. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, and we will have time for questions at the end. And I will signal to Jackie with my hand up when there's 2 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy, for that introduction. I'll assume everyone can hear me unless someone speaks up. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I'm really excited to share some of our work that we've been doing at UBC on student sense of belonging and a broader project to enhance equity in our first-year biology, chemistry, and physics courses. So this, I think, nicely follows from some of the talks we've just heard. Really excellent stuff going on in terms of indigenization, decolonization, equity, diversity, inclusion, and chemistry. So it gives me a lot of hope. And again, thanks for being here to hear about our project. So I'll start with a little bit about equity and active learning, and then focus on one particular aspect, which is sense of belonging. And toward the end of my talk, end with some things that chemistry educators can do to help foster belonging and hopefully make our courses more equitable, which I think is a great goal. I work with a team across our 3 departments, essentially, life sciences, chemistry, and physics. So here's some of my collaborators. We have also some people from our Science Center for Learning and Teaching who work with us, and very importantly, students. So Amelia, Beck, Yulia, Taylor, Zara, and Shivani have all worked with us as students, and it's really important for me anyway to keep that kind of student voice front and center in this work. And so it was great to see some other students presenting today. We received a little bit of funding from our Equity and Inclusion Office, and that was called the Equity and Inclusion Scholars Program, a little injection of funding to enhance equity in courses. That went along with UBC's Student Diversity Initiative. We are able to get a lot of work-learn funding, which subsidizes our student salaries. And then, of course, I just want to say thanks to all of our students who've answered our surveys and interviews, the instructors who've let us do this work in their class, and also our inclusive teaching workshop team. So big effort here, and I wanted to acknowledge them right off the bat. So taking a step back a little bit, what do we mean by equitable teaching? And you might have a vision of what you mean or what you think I mean when I say that. One really clean, tight definition is from Brian Dewsbury, which is really, it's when demographic variables don't predict student success or failure. That's a bit of a quantitative view of things, but certainly I would want that in my classes. I would want students who do identify with various groups to have similar outcomes, right? And there's a lot of discussion in the literature about equity and whether this is because of, different levels of preparation and other things, and that's all great. But no matter how students come into my class, I want to make sure that they have equal chances once they leave. So UBC, for example, we have our second year major selection process relies really heavily on first year grades. And so we want to ensure all students have chances to get into the majors they want and go on to the careers they want and so on. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And active learning, as I'm sure many of you know, are those teaching strategies really designed to engage students during class time in thinking and reflecting and building their knowledge constructively, usually with peers. And there's a great paper that builds on some of the large analyses of active learning compared to passive instruction. But this paper does an analysis in terms of equity. So really separates out students from majority groups and minority groups and those with more underrepresented identities, and shows that actually the differences between those two groups, the represented and underrepresented, do differ in active and passive classes. So this scale on the y-axis here is a difference, and we can see that the difference is smaller for active learning classes in this large analysis, which is really exciting. And same for failure rate. There's a smaller difference in failure rates for active classes. So that's really exciting. That's good. That should be additional motivation for us to use active learning, I think. But do we know this? Do you know the answer to this in your class? Do you know how your students would be doing based on different demographic variables? You can give me a Zoom reaction if you know or don't know. And I suspect since we're in the Canadian context, we usually don't have access to really detailed demographic data to look at this in our own context. This study is from the US. It's a really common type of analysis done, but in Canada, we don't really do this very much. So the group of us was really curious to see how this was looking in our own classes. And the other part I'll talk about before I launch into our analysis is that active learning is really social, right? So we are usually asking students to talk to each other, work in small groups, play different roles in their group work. And this study in biology showed that different students might experience active learning differently. So not all students experience active learning in the same way. So one finding from this study, which has many, many great things in there, is that women had less of a preference to be the leader or explainer in group work. Also, they were able to look at international students, maybe preferring to play more of a listener role and having some enhanced anxiety compared to other groups. So that's in this study. In that context, again, we were really interested in how students experienced our own classes, because we know that not all students are experiencing the same way, and how that can contribute or take away from equity in terms of outcomes. So our project, we're looking at 3 different things. We have a detailed learning activities questionnaire, so how students are participating and perceiving the activities done in a class. Then we're looking at some psychological constructs of self-efficacy and belonging. And we have another measure, which is students' perceptions of the classroom climate. And so some of these are more from the literature, some we're building from the ground up. So the sense of belonging data I'll share today is from our own instrument, but the self-efficacy is from a published instrument, and so on. And importantly, we're doing this work in Canada because so much of the literature is from the US. And I'll say before I share some of our data that while we're looking for demographic inequities to point us in the direction of solving those inequities, we're certainly not taking the perspective that there's something deficient or wrong with the students. We're really taking the perception that if we do see differences, those are likely created by the education system and our societal systems. And we have a role to play as educators in fixing that and addressing that. So that's our stance and how we're approaching this. And our project so far, we've been working since 2019. We developed a lot of tools early on, and then of course the pandemic came along and things like classroom climate really shifted. So of course the pandemic is a big part of our class. But we've had different surveys, over 9,000 student responses, and we survey students in each class 3 times, pre, mid, and post. And we collect our own very detailed demographic data. Of course, if students don't want to provide that data to us, that's fine. But we carefully developed this tool with the assistance of our Equity and Inclusion Office. I think someone's not muted. It's just distracting me just a tiny bit. So again, I mentioned I was going to focus mostly on sense of belonging for the sake of time. And I think it's a really interesting thing that maybe we don't talk about enough. So sense of belonging is this idea that you're accepted and valued as part of a group. And to me, that makes sense. We're in a social learning environment, often when we're trying to get students to work together. So maybe this is relevant. There's also other types of belonging, right? So there's social belonging, and then we can think of how somebody feels they belong or identify with or fit in with some kind of disciplinary community. So there is a community of chemists. Do I see that I belong there, right? Would be some way to look at that. And so these perceptions everybody has, even in first year courses, right? They're trying to suss out what major am I going to have? Where would I fit in? Where would I be able to contribute to the world, and so on. So we're looking at sense of belonging pretty in a detailed way, both social belonging and disciplinary belonging. And why do we care about this? Well, the literature shows that it is predictive of motivation, engagement, intention to persist in a discipline, learning and achievement as well. Some people in certain groups might have lower levels of belonging. And that's a problem in and of itself. But interestingly, what also happens is that students in those groups with lower sense of belonging, that is a stronger predictor of things like persistence and learning. So not only is it lower, but it also accounts for more of kind of what happens in the future. So this paper by Lewis goes through a lot of different studies and looking at persistence in the discipline and also some achievement data. And what they find is a belonging really does contribute to people's feeling that they should stay or go in a discipline. And I encourage you to read that study because it teases apart belonging from self-efficacy and also looks at students' achievement levels, right? And so independent of those things, sense of belonging is important. In our own context at UBC, I was lucky enough to work with a student who interviewed some non-binary chemistry students. And the interview was really open-ended to find out about students' experience. And here is a really common thing or theme that we found in that interview data. And I'll let you read it, but the highlighted part is really just this feeling that they don't belong. And the mechanism by which that could affect learning is that it's actually quite distracting. If you're sitting and working with a small group of students and you're thinking about how your identity influences your relationships with those people, well, that's going to take you away from the moment, the learning moment. And so what we want to make sure is that people can get to know their groups, become comfortable with them, have an inclusive environment, all of that then will help people focus on the learning and the task at hand. So this was definitely the first time when I started really thinking about groups are important, of course, but we do really care about individual students and how they're experiencing the learning environment. And so we have this qualitative and quantitative approach going on with our project. So our question is to look at disciplinary and social belonging, specifically in first year. We're focusing on first year biology, chemistry, and physics. And we're really taking as rigorous as possible approach to developing our measures and validating those measures. And so we've split belonging into these two halves, disciplinary belonging and social belonging. So here's our instrument, and happy to share this later with anyone who contacts me. We're still undergoing kind of revisions and validation. We've done some quantitative validation, and we're doing some interviews with students. And so the disciplinary belonging approach we chose to take was to ask students the extent to which they feel similar or different from people in a blank community, biology, chemistry, and physics. For social belonging, we're really seeing that there's two factors in our instrument. The extent people can get some support from others in their class, and then the extent to which they feel connected or disconnected from them. And we ask people to respond on a Likert scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, and we're using a 7-point scale. So that's our 1 to 7. And what I'll show you in a moment is going to be some aggregate scores where we take these 3 parts and average them. And then we're going to look at some different demographic disaggregation and see if we see anything interesting. This is our belonging scale. Part of our validation is to really figure out what students think about when we ask them about the community. And actually, this should say biology, chemistry, and physics as well, because we have different versions of this question for each course. And so we're telling them in our validation that we're defining the chemistry community as people who are pursuing a degree or working in this field. So undergraduates are certainly part of our chemistry community for sure. And we wanted to figure out, what do people picture when they think of this community? And the reason this is so important is the extent to which somebody can align their own personality and identity with members of that community is a really important part of belonging. So if people think my characteristics are represented in the community, I belong there. And if they think their characteristics are not represented in that community, they might think they don't belong there. And the disciplinary differences, I think you'll also find really interesting. So my colleague Ashley coded some of these responses. We're still working through these data, but just sort of the top 3 things people in each discipline said, or people thought about each discipline. So there's always interest and passion and, that kind of scientific thinking that comes up for sure. Of course, chemists people think about somebody working in a lab. Physics, people think about somebody who really excels at math, which makes sense as well. One thing that really struck me from these results is that the biologists, what came into their top 3 was this idea that you're focusing on the environment and health and people and animals, and this feeling of making the world a better place if you're a biologist or in the biology community. And I think those of us who identify as chemists would say, hey, we're making the world a better place too, but maybe it's not coming across to students as much as it could be, right? So maybe something to think about in how you frame chemistry to your students and when students are picking their majors. So this is very interesting. We're working through that data. The quantitative data, again, we have disciplinary belonging and social belonging. Disciplinary belonging, we measure at the start of term and end of term, but I'm just showing the end of term here. And then social belonging, we measure about 2/3 of the way through in our mid-course survey. And analyzing race and ethnicity data is not easy. It's not straightforward. We're certainly as a team learning a lot about good ways to do this. And what we've landed on for now, but we're still exploring things, is saying, okay, if we're thinking about belonging, perhaps the important thing is, do you have people around you that are like you? Are you in the majority group or not? And so at UBC, our majority groups are Chinese, South Asian, and white. And then we have many, many other race and ethnicity groups, but they would be, smaller than 10% of the entire class. So I was starting to think about, if I put students in a small group, are they going to end up with somebody with the same race or ethnicity or not? So I'm not going to go through this in every single bit. I didn't put sample sizes on here because it would really clutter the graph. But you can see we're looking at differences between chemistry, biology, and physics. And you can see for disciplinary belonging, chemistry lands in about the middle, biology a bit stronger, physics a bit lower. For our peer support, chemistry is looking pretty good and not major alarming differences in our disaggregation, and same with social belonging. One thing that differentiates our work is we're looking at lots of variables. So we also have data on disability and health status. So if somebody has an ongoing health concern or a diagnosed disability, we have lots of categories. I'm just showing 4 here for simplicity. Neurological might be somebody with ADHD, for example. Mental health would be anxiety, depression, etc. And then visual impairment. And again, we're really looking, we hope there's no differences, right? That's not the goal here. But perhaps if there are differences, that will help point us in the direction of an intervention we can do, and then measure and see if that was helpful. So we can see for the social belonging that students with no disabilities in biology are quite a bit higher. For chemistry, it's very similar. And for students in physics, those with mental health conditions might be lower. Again, these groups are not super big. And then I'll last show gender here. We have men, women, and non-binary people represented in this graph. We do have an option for two-spirit, etc. on our survey. Those numbers are pretty small. And what I notice when I look at this graph is that if I'm mainly looking at men versus women, we see that at least in chemistry, our women are scoring lower on the disciplinary belonging scale, but higher on the social belonging scale. So what I like about this is it does kind of point you in the direction of where you would want to intervene. So maybe I don't need to, for gender, spend a lot of time focused on social groups, maybe for the men, maybe they need to make more friends in the class. But for disciplinary belonging, perhaps I should do some more things to help people see themselves as chemists. So what can you do? So I have 2 minutes left. I'm going to go over some things that I think we can all do. And certainly representation was brought up this morning a lot. Consider it in your class and your materials. It's really a cycle, right? Lack of representation leads to lower sense of belonging, less likely to persist, which is enforcing our lack of representation, and so on. So we need to do something here for sure. Consider first impressions. Do you have orientations events for chemistry and science students, and who's at those events, right? So our chemistry materials and our university events are really important. People brought up great ways to spotlight scientists with all sorts of different identities, which is great. So doing that, super essential. But there's some other things, right? There's key moments, which the literature talks about as belonging uncertainty moments. So these moments where students might have received an assessment score that wasn't very good, received some feedback that was perhaps negative, but seeming critical, they feel lonely or aware of stereotypes. And these are times where the instructor can really intervene. So at least for me, when a student has a low assessment score, I don't say, oh, they should not be a chemist, right? I think, oh, what's going on with them? Did they not have good background knowledge for this? What can they do to improve? And we need to be overt at talking about that. Normalize challenges. Say a time when you really faced a challenge in your courses. For feedback, I really encourage people when they give feedback to check out this article and think about framing your feedback with the information that they can achieve the high expectation. Not just here's some feedback to improve, but something like I'm giving you this feedback because not only do I have high expectations, but I know you can reach them. Students need to hear that messaging, and this paper is all about that. Feeling lonely, certainly universities can think about affinity groups of similar people, supporting social connections in class, maybe structure for group work, different roles. And I'm a big fan of persistent group work. Let them work together for a month or so before you switch them up so they can get to know each other. And finally, thinking about negative stereotypes about their own group. We've talked about spotlighting different scientists, emphasizing that chemistry ability is not innate. There's no chemistry gene, right? So fostering that growth mindset, and then think about ways you can have different students participate in class so that others see them participating in class. That's really key. So to end, I'll just end by saying the sense of belonging not only is a really important human need, we all have the need to belong, it's also related to learning. And so we can bring it into our class a little bit more. So I'm going to end on this slide just saying that I'm really excited that we're expanding this work across Canada, and happy to have more collaborators if you want to look at our tools and join us in the analysis here and then fix the issues that we dig up. So email me if you want to collaborate, and I'm also looking for students. So if you have anyone who would like to join us, let me know. Stop there. Almost on time.
No problem. All right,
Thanks.
please join me in thanking Jackie for a pretty interesting talk in terms of how we're going to approach the diversity and equity in our future classes. If there's anyone that would like to ask any questions, please put your hand up. Nicole has a question. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, cool. Thank you so much, Jackie. That was really great. I really liked hearing about that. I was just curious if one of the most challenging teaching moments I had in the last 2 years, I think, was having a trans student in a small group. And I'm just like, the data you were showing would not capture how uncomfortable that student would be and how in the bigger picture. So, and that slide in particular about the awareness of stereotypes in groups was particularly jarring to me, because that student was misgendered by their fellow students. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you capture that for us? How do you capture that data when you're looking at, say, man, woman, non-binary, but this is a student who is a man, but the student was being misgendered? Anyway,
yes, great. Thanks so much for asking that. So when it's a small number of people, of course, we can do qualitative studies like this, but we do have a demographic variable that is asking people if they've had a trans experience. So at least our demographic tool, we separate out gender identity from trans experience. I didn't show that data, and there would be a couple % probably of our classes in there, but this was just a snapshot of a few variables. And so we do have that data. I think it's important to collect that. And so that's kind of from the research side. And then the teaching side, what I've heard from working with non-binary and trans students in this research is that it goes a long way to be acknowledged, right? And I'm sure you do this in your teaching of, stamping out any instances where it's just man-woman data, or that trans is not celebrated and an option for being. And even I've just heard students be so relieved when an instructor mentions it in passing, like, this is a trans scientist, da, 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 they do this. And then they're like, oh, my identity is affirmed, and then I can ask that person for help, or potentially be a bit more comfortable introducing myself to my small group and so on. And then I think one thing with the persistent groups is getting the student in the right small group, and then not switching groups all the time, because there definitely is that cognitive overload of, do I, introduce myself in this way, or, are they thinking about my identity instead of just thinking about the content? And that can be really stressful. So something where it's a persistent thing, I think, is really important. Great question.
Yeah. Sorry, David. Hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation at another time. Looking at the clock, it's 11 o'clock. So unfortunately, we're going to session D.